Zach, thank you so much for giving up your very, very valuable time to talk to the good people of North Queensland on Northern Volta.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Matt.
No worries, mate. You're a data scientist. Tell us
That's right.
what that means.
Yeah, well, it's actually a very broad term that means a lot of different things in different contexts. And generally, it just means that people who are working with data and trying to understand data. And in my case, it actually meant doing sort of more sophisticated statistical analysis and also machine learning and artificial intelligence. So we were doing a lot of training large neural networks. These basically roughly highly simplified models of the human brain, but themselves extremely complex models in terms of what we can now do with computers. Basically, we train them on legal text and news data and tax and IP and science and finance data. So those are all the kinds of data that we had at Thomson Reuters. But basically, we train these neural networks on these various different kinds of data and try to get them to do things like read a legal document, understand what's in the legal document enough to actually analyze it or find key points within the document, and then sort of write a summary or write some kind of analysis of the legal document. And so that's what I was doing. I was doing, partly it was like statistical analysis and data and, sort of data processing. And the bulk of what I was doing was actually leading a team of other scientists applying these deep learning methods. When deep learning is basically a word for these large neural networks to our data. So,
whom was that for?
So that was for Thomson Reuters. Thomson Reuters is one of the largest news media companies in the world. They syndicate to thousands of other publications, hundreds of other broadcasters, because they have not only print and articles and so forth, but they also do video content, and they reach I think over 1 billion viewers every single day because they publish to so wide. So they have this incredible footprint, this incredible reach, and they're also consistently viewed as one of the most trustworthy and balanced news organizations. So in addition to their giant footprint, they have maybe an outsized influence even beyond that because people trust them so much. So I was working for this centralized capability within Thomson Reuters, and we would provide this data science capability to all the different business units within the company. So that includes, like I was describing, that includes news, that includes legal, tax, IP and science, and finance.
I got to say, look, I'd actually really like to talk about that too. Oh, we won't digress about that right now because that's just cool and fascinating. So my understanding is Thomson Reuters has an internal social media site called The Hub. Could you tell us how influential that is inside the community of the organization itself?
Yeah. I mean, the Hub is basically where all of our sort of community, like company-wide dialogue takes place. So if it's not happening in like a meeting or, in person, and we have offices spread all over the country, all over the world, rather. If it's not happening in person, then it's happening on the Hub. So that we have wide-ranging discussions on the Hub, from technical matters to, business strategy to basically everything we're doing, and that includes people like posting pictures of their dogs and posting, political things that they're concerned about, and included hundreds of posts about people supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and exclaiming basically how important the movement was and how deeply they felt about it. Now, whether or not that the Hub is more of a reflection of the company culture, or, I mean, obviously, since so much of the company culture is happening on the Hub, the hub is influencing the company culture, but I sort of think of it more as a reflection of the company culture. So when we'll get into in a minute, probably sort of the kinds of things that I would see on the hub and the sort of new racial ideology that I was seeing growing on the hub. And I saw that more as a reflection of what was going on within the company, more than something that was being powered by the hub, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And look, it's like any of these kind of things, really. It's kind of like the relationship between the observer and the observed. Is it a wave, particle kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah.
But look, all right. So we've established the background. Now, could you tell us your story? Tell us what happened, and I'd also like you to tell us what drove you, because that's going to be a question that people ask.
Yeah. Well, basically what happened was I was fired for complaining about racialized bullying in the workplace and how it was making it impossible for us to report truthfully the news to the public. So I'd been working there for about 6 years or so, and as a data scientist, and over that time, I'd sort of, like I just alluded to, sort of witnessed this new kind of racial ideology spreading through the company, and particularly celebration of the Black Lives Matter movement and an uncritical adoption of the core tenets of the movement throughout every level of the company, from top senior leadership to all the way down the line. And that concerned me because as a data scientist, I'd actually been following the research about Black Lives Matter as it was coming out of academia. And what I discovered was that the core claim of the movement, that police were targeting Black people or biased towards shooting Black people, was completely false. But not only that, the research also showed that that false claim had been driving reductions in policing, which had in turn led to soaring violent crime, including thousands of people murdered. So the falsehoods being spread by the Black Lives Matter movement had literally led to thousands of Black people being murdered, people dead who would otherwise be alive today. Now, I knew that as someone with white skin at Thomson Reuters, if I said anything critical of the Black Lives Matter movement, that I'd be putting my career in jeopardy. But I also felt like Thomson Reuters had a public trust to be reporting truthfully, especially about an issue like this, where people's lives were hanging in the balance. So I just wrote up a summary of the academic literature, the findings about Black Lives Matter, and I posted it to our internal collaboration forum, the Hub. And just as I had feared, that immediately made me the target of this barrage of intensely hateful and ultimately highly racialized personal attacks. And the company's response to that was basically to censor everything that I had written, all the academic literature and the facts that I had summarized, and to shut down any kind of critical examination of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that was, of course, even more disturbing to me, because now not only were we reporting these falsehoods, which were getting people killed, but the company was saying, and we are never allowed to talk about it. We're never allowed to examine the facts underlying our reporting, and in this case, misreporting. So and up to this point, I was mostly dealing just with HR. So I was hoping that if I made the company's senior leadership aware of what was going on, that maybe they could right the ship. So I then drafted an email to my colleagues and senior leadership, basically describing everything that had happened to me, this racialized bullying, how it completely shut down any kind of conversation about the facts underlying our reporting. And then they fired me immediately for sending that email.
Obviously, I want you and I need you to correct me if my interpretation of this is wrong. So you're concerned about facts. You reported the facts. You were sacked for reporting the facts. And not only was the messenger shot, but the messenger was vilified because of the color of their skin, ostensibly to prevent racism. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty close. I mean, I was literally fired. They called me up after censoring my post and shutting down any kind of critical examination of Black Lives Matter. They called me up and told me that if I talked about my experience of this racialized bullying, and how it shut down the conversation on any company communications channel that would lead to discipline, including termination. And then when I sent an email, they immediately fired me for that. So that's literally what I was fired for, was complaining about this racialized bullying. But yeah, I mean, otherwise that's right. I mean, it was sort of interesting actually to look at it, because, it wasn't, so the company has this sort of extreme new racial ideology, but the way that it's enforced is sort of multifactorial, right? So first you have these sort of like shock troops, almost like these BLM supporters who are willing to go out and transgress all the norms of, professional decorum, and basically, insult someone, imply that they're racists, or, in my case, they literally compared me to a sympathizer for the Ku Klux Klan. And then the company doesn't do that in their own capacity, but they allow this to happen. And then when you complain about it, then they fire you. So it's like there's multiple things going on to enforce this rigid sort of racial orthodoxy, essentially. They told me I wasn't allowed to talk about it.
And you spoke.
I was not allowed to complain about it, and they fired me. I mean, there was no issue really. I mean, the reason that to be completely clear, they fired me via email, and the email they sent to me said something. This is close to word for word. It said, "The manner in which you've conducted yourself in recent weeks does not conform to our expectations for you as a leader within the company." So basically, they fired me for the whole thing. I mean, they told me beforehand they were going to fire me if I sent any emails about what I'd experienced. But so, I mean,
the zen of the thing, the tone of the thing. We can't specifically put our fingers on it. It's all these threads that are woven together. We don't think that you're the right sort of person to be there. But look, let's get into the actual stats that you discussed. Are you in a position to do that?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about those facts.
Yeah. So, so the core of my post was really just examining this, the core claim of the Black Lives Matter movement, that police are biased towards shooting Black people. And when we're looking at a question of bias in the application of lethal force, what we're looking for is a mismatch between the number of times that police actually use lethal force and the number of times that they needed to use lethal force in order to protect themselves or others, right? That's what bias means. It means that for one group, police are more readily using lethal force in relation to how often they need to than they are for another group. The best measure of how often police use lethal force, need to use lethal force rather, is how often they're actually murdered by criminals, because that gets rid of any question of subjectivity. If you're murdered by a criminal, clearly your life was in grave danger. So when you look at it in those terms, what you find is that police disproportionately shoot whites in relation to how often whites murder police officers. They do not disproportionately shoot Blacks in relation to how often Black criminals murder police officers. So in fact, if they shoot Black suspects markedly at a markedly lower rate than you'd expect, given the number of police officers who are murdered by Black criminals. So right off the bat, the fact is that police shoot whites disproportionately to the rate at which police actually need to use lethal force to protect themselves. So I reviewed those statistics, and I also reviewed the best study to date of bias in the application of lethal force by police. And this study is the only one that controls for the circumstances of shootings. So, and it's actually really important to understand how critical that is, right? If you're comparing two different groups and you want to understand whether police are using lethal force more readily for one group than another, you want to make sure you're comparing the same kinds of circumstances. Like, you don't want to be looking at, for one group, situations where criminals are literally shooting at police officers And for another group, a situation where a kid steals a candy bar off the street and runs, or off a store shelf and runs down the street, right? So it's like critical that when you're making these comparisons, you're comparing the same kind of circumstances. This is the only study, literally the only study, that actually looks at the circumstances and controls for them and makes sure they're comparing apples to apples. It was done by one of the top researchers in the field, Roland Fryer at Harvard University. And he actually set out to prove that the claims of BLM were correct. And he was shocked to find that when he controlled for the circumstances, police do not more readily shoot Black people. He was actually so shocked that he formed a completely new research team, because this process of controlling for circumstances is very intensive. It takes an entire team. So he formed a completely new research team to rule out any possibility that there was somehow bias or something within his team that resulted in those findings. And he repeated it and found exactly the same thing. So basically, my post to the hub summarized the statistics, summarized the best studies coming out of academia, and then looked at the academic evidence about what those falsehoods from the Black Lives Matter movement were doing to vulnerable communities that were struggling with violent crime. And there's now a sort of growing consensus along a number of ways of analyzing the situation that those falsehoods are driving reductions in policing, which are leading to soaring violent crime. So that's the overall summary of what my post said.
A lot of information put there very succinctly, if I may make the observation. Look, I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into the people that are suffering as a result of this. You've indicated before that it seems to be disproportionately marginalised people. Can you tell me about the research on that? Because I've seen some papers that are basically saying the Ferguson effect, which is fundamentally what we're talking about here. The Ferguson effect is fake and it's not real. And Fryer doesn't seem to agree with that consensus either. So I'll get you to comment. On, okay, we know who benefits, who's suffering from this.
Yeah. So the evidence for the Ferguson effect is really pretty strong. After he did his police bias study, Fryer actually did a whole new study to look at what the impact of these, protests and these falsehoods were on these communities. And he was actually able to develop a study design where he was able to compare cities that did not have a large, Black Lives Matter protesting movement to cities that do. And he found that, a huge spike in the city in murder rates and crime rates in the cities that do, and no spike in the cities that don't. So he was able actually to estimate the number of people who were killed in these 5 cities as a direct result of the Black Lives Matter falsehoods and protests and so forth. And over just like a year or so, and it was like something like 900 additional murders. And that's just for these 5 cities over a year. Now, we all know that the crime spike and the murder spike has spread across the entire country, and has hit dozens of different cities and has been going on now for many years. So the number of people who've been killed has got to be in the thousands, probably well over 10,000. Though I don't know of any study that comprehensively tries to estimate the total number of people killed by this. Now, it's interesting to look at who's being killed. Now, you can look at the spike in murder rates over like the last 5 or 6 years, and what you see is that all of the burden is being carried by Blacks and Latinos. Almost none of it carried by whites, and zero of it carried by Asians. So you can actually see this sort of like, this upward trajectory in the graphs for Blacks and Latinos, a little, for whites, it's completely flat. maybe a tiny little blip, but almost like basically completely flat. The blip is completely statistically insignificant. So the people who are suffering from this are, are poor, vulnerable communities that were already struggling with violent crime.
So fundamentally, and again, what I'm seeking here is correction. I want to make this crystal clear that if I make an assertion and it's wrong, I want it corrected. Fundamentally, one of the hypotheses put forward is that African American people are over-policed, but it kind of seems that the direct opposite is true. The issue is being under-policed and not having enough access to justice administration services.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Like, I mean, there are a couple of things that come to mind when I think about that. One is the town that I grew up in, Newton, where, it's a fairly wealthy town, predominantly white, 0 murders on average every year, probably. Just a couple towns over, you have, the Boston neighborhoods like Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, which have dozens of murders every year. Now, if almost all Black people being murdered. Now, if those murders were happening in Newton, where I grew up, I think the residents there would be calling for a police officer on every street corner, right? They would be calling for the police officer to pat down every single, person under 25 on their way, right? Their concern would be about protecting their kids from being murdered in this out of control sort of gang violence. So it's really remarkable to say that these communities where almost all the murders in Boston are happening are over-policed. And you can look at that also more, you can look at that in a more systematic way. So what I just described is an anecdotal, more of an, and my own anecdotal experience where almost everyone in the city is being murdered in these, predominantly Black neighborhoods. And if you look through the faces, they're almost all, hardly any whites in the list of, murdered people. And I linked to some places where you can literally look through the faces of the people who've been murdered. But, there's been more systematic investigations of this. So the US Justice Department publishes the National Crime Victimization Survey, where they actually compare the rates at which members of different racial groups commit crimes to the rates at which they're arrested for crimes. So you'd expect if there was over-policing, you'd see higher arrest rates for one racial group than another. But what we find is that there aren't higher racial arrest rates in comparison to the rate at which each group is committing crimes. So the arrest rates are actually very, very comparable across all racial groups, interestingly. So that really undermines the idea that there's some kind of like systematic over-policing on a national scale. And that really comports with, our firsthand experience seeing, like I was describing in Boston. So.
Exactly. And this comparative benchmark thing is so important. Like when BLM came to Australia, the number that they were tossing around was 432. So because between the time we had a Royal Commission, which in Australia, still being a constitutional monarchy, is the highest form of public inquiry that you can have. And they handed down their findings in 1989, just before I joined the police. And so between the end of that and 2020, July 2020, which is when BLM kind of really came to Australia, 432 people had died in custody. So that was the number thrown around. But the comparative benchmark was wrong. They were saying, oh, well, there's this many people dying in custody. But what they didn't report, the benchmark they used was about 3% of the population of Australia is Indigenous. But I think it was about 14 or 16% of deaths in custody were Indigenous. And they're going, well, clearly people are being murdered. There's something going on here. But of course, that's just not the right comparative benchmark. The comparative benchmark is how much crime, how much victimization, and how many people are in custody proportionally. And as soon as you look at those things, in fact, Indigenous people die slightly less in custody in Australia. And the inquiry that I talked about was called the Deaths in Custody inquiry. Fundamentally, what happened, Zach, was the police in Australia, and this is in the late 80s. We had BLM before it was trendy without the slogans. Australia were put and I really don't mean this to sound melodramatic or hyperbole. I mean this when I say it. The police in Australia were put on were fundamentally charged with genocide. That's what the inquiry was into. And it's all on the website. Two really interesting things happened, and I think it's very comparable to what happened to you. First, when the inquiry was finished, and the inquiry even stated it, the commissioner of the inquiry himself stated, he goes, "Look, we expected to find that the police were murdering people. That didn't happen." He went on to say went on to make qualifications, and the qualifications he made were spot on. He goes, "Look, there was kind of a fair bit of neglect." Really simply to sort of oversimplify, what was happening was the police, especially in remote rural areas, were arresting people for minor offences like drunkenness, what you guys call disturbing the peace, but for what was asked like disorderly conduct and stuff like that, throwing them in the watch house. They were the local town drunk. Throw a bit of food at them, throw a bit of water at them, don't search them properly, let them keep their coats and belts, go away because, they're resting at night. So the cop would go home, have dinner, come back in the morning, and the person is hanging, just got rigor mortis or something like that. Now that's, that's neglect. Like, you've got a duty of care to that person, and that's disgraceful. I am in no way saying that that's okay, and the police, that simply shouldn't have happened. But it's very important to make the distinction that that's not murder.
Yeah. Not
murder. And the inquiry actually articulated they specifically expected to find it, and they didn't. Something even sinister was in 1995 or 3, I've forgotten which year it was. There was a criminology department that was formed and attached to the inquiry. So there was like this, a number of leading criminologists were attached to get the stats, to get the data, to break it down, to do what you do with that. And when they started putting forward the data that proved that Indigenous people were not dying because that neglect thing, that was happening across the board. Like, it wasn't even the cases like, oh, they're Indigenous, we don't care about them. It's like black, white, brindle, coppers were just doing what I kind of said to you before. Now, I'll put this in our discussion pages. The head criminologist himself said, when we reported this, we were actually accused, and I'm certain this is the language that he used. We were accused of being disloyal to the inquiry for stating the fact. That's a really serious accusation. That's fundamentally, so when you have, you're an academic, I'm not. Basically, they were accused of corruption and fiddling the books because they didn't contribute to the narrative that the commission expected to find. Yeah. So, this has been going on. The reason I raise this is for two points. One, you're not alone. So I don't know if that will give you any sense of feeling a little bit better. But two, this idea that if you don't contribute to a narrative, you're somehow corrupt. If you just report the facts, that means that we can't actually address real issues in our society. If
I think that's
really matter,
I think that's exactly the issue here. Is that so first of all, there are Black scholars on both sides of this issue, right? There are Black community leaders on both sides of this issue. But the only perspective you're allowed to have as a white person is the pro-BLM perspective. If you don't have that perspective, then basically they'll try to, personality assassinate you or end your career, cancel you. But that's an incredibly dangerous and damaging environment for the people who are struggling, right? Because most of the people in power are still white. So if most of the people in power are only allowed to have one perspective and they're not allowed to actually discuss what's going on, but they'll be character assassinated. If they actually have an honest discussion about it, then you're basically guaranteeing that the vulnerable communities will never get the policy that they need from the government and and other social institutions to improve the environment in those communities. So it's just like, it's incredible. I mean, I think that ultimately, like, basically, in the US, there's like some kind of like line, like, this is not the time for white people to be talking. This is the time for them to be listening, right? And I'm like, no, everyone needs to be participating in this conversation. If white people are not participating in this conversation, if they're only allowed to adopt the perspective of the most aggressive and loudest voices in the Black community, for instance, and the ones that are being promoted by, the white leadership, ironically, in the media, then we can't have a real conversation. We can't look at the facts. Everyone needs to be participating, and everyone needs to be able to have an opinion. This is actually something I appreciated when I was talking to Coleman Hughes, because at some point I was like, I know I'm not allowed to say this as a white person. He's like, whoa, stop right there, right? This is like one of the most damaging things that's happened to our dialogue about these questions, right? We all need to be able to have like an honest conversation about this, and it's just impossible if people are being immediately canceled.
That's exactly right. And the other ridiculous idea behind it is this: white people have got no skin in the game. It's like, we all live together. Like, for me, in my street here, it's predominantly white, but it's multiracial. Like, we've got Indigenous people around here. We've got Asian people living around here. There are Indigenous kids in my kids' school, soccer teams and stuff like that. And we've got here in Queensland, we've got Indigenous people in both state and federal as federal representatives. It's just ridiculous to say that we can't talk to each other.
Yeah.
But I'll frame it around another question. Look, what do they want? What do you think CRT wants?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, ultimately, I think there is this kind of socialist vision, basically. But I think they believe most of what they're saying. So I think they sort of fundamentally, I think most of them probably, as hard as it is to imagine someone sort of believing this, who has any kind of level of intelligence, I think they believe that every disparity is an example of racial discrimination. It's preposterously moronic, because you could just look at like, Asians do much better than whites along a host of dimensions, right? In terms of education and income and health, right? Does that mean that our society is racially discriminating against whites? No, obviously there are different cultures that are contributing to different levels of success among different groups. And sometimes those cultures break down or have some correlation with racial factors. So, I mean, it's amazing that people will still say that, disparities are synonymous with discrimination. But I think a lot of people nevertheless believe that. And so I think that I think what they're really trying to do is at a certain level is just trying to get rid of this sort of phantom discrimination that they believe is happening and is evidenced by all these disparities. But I also think that there's there is a deeper level. There are people who maybe understand basic statistics a little bit better, and I think there really is this kind. I mean, it's pretty clear if you read the literature, and a lot of these the writings of a lot of these theorists, that they have this socialist vision in mind, of basically a world without this, any kind of differences in wealth, and where we just have a vastly expanded government infrastructure and state, and I think for some people this is a way of pushing that, and for other people it's just they just have drunk the Kool-Aid and they just haven't thought about the details.